What would you do if you had 24 hours left to live, and the only thing you needed to do before you died was find the son you abandoned 30 years ago? This is the story of a dying veteran's last mission and the reunion that no one saw coming. Frank Miller was 72 years old, and he had been dying for a long time in ways that had nothing to do with cancer. The cancer was just the final chapter. The dying started 30 years ago on a rainy night in Portland when he packed a single bag, left his sleeping wife and infant son, and disappeared into the darkness like a coward. That is what he called himself, a coward. The world called him a hero. The United States government gave him a Medal of Honor for what he did in the jungles of Vietnam in 1969. He had carried 3 wounded soldiers through enemy fire for 600 meters to a helicopter landing zone. He took 2 bullets and kept moving. He saved 3 lives and became a legend in his unit. But what the medal did not capture was what happened inside Frank's mind after that day. The nightmares came every single night. The sound of gunfire that was not there. The faces of men who did not make it. The smell of burning that followed him into every room. He came home from the war a different man, wearing the same face. He tried. God knows he tried. He married Susan, a kind woman who loved him without understanding what lived inside his head. They had a son named David. Frank held that baby in the delivery room and promised himself he would be a good father. But the nightmares got worse. The drinking started. The rage that came from nowhere and disappeared just as fast, leaving destruction in its wake. One night he woke up from a dream about the jungle and found himself standing in the nursery with his fist clenched, screaming at shadows while his infant son wailed in the crib. Susan was in the doorway with terror in her eyes. That was the night Frank knew he had to leave, not because he did not love them, because he loved them too much to become the thing that destroyed them. He left a note that said only, "I am sorry. You are safer without me." For 30 years he carried the weight of that choice, and now, sitting in a Veterans Affairs hospital in Portland, with a doctor telling him his lungs were full of cancer, and he had 24 to 48 hours remaining, Frank Miller had one final mission. Find David, tell him the truth, give him the only thing worth giving, and pray that God would grant a dying man one last act of grace before the lights went out. How far would you travel on your last day alive to undo the worst mistake you ever made? Frank checked himself out of the VA hospital against medical advice at 6 in the morning. He signed the papers with hands that shook from pain and medication in the simple effort of staying alive. The nurse tried to stop him. The doctor warned him he might not survive the trip. Frank smiled at them with the calm of a man who had already made peace with dying. What he could not make peace with was dying without seeing his son's face one more time. He had one lead. 3 years ago, a fellow veteran at the homeless shelter where Frank volunteered had shown him a newspaper article. Local doctor named Physician of the Year. The photograph showed a young man in a white coat with dark hair and his mother's kind eyes. Dr. David Miller, Seattle General Hospital. Frank had cut that article out and kept it in his wallet ever since, taking it out every night like a prayer card, memorizing the face of the boy he had left behind, the boy who had grown into a man without him, the boy who had become a healer while his father became a ghost. Frank boarded the 7:15 Greyhound bus to Seattle with an oxygen tank, a small duffel bag, and a worn wooden box containing his Medal of Honor. The bus ride was 4 hours. Every bump sent pain radiating through his chest. Every breath was a negotiation with lungs that were mostly tumor now. But Frank had endured worse. He had crawled through mud under fire for 600 meters. He could sit on a bus for 4 hours. He arrived in Seattle at 11:30. The city was gray and wet and enormous. He took a taxi to Seattle General Hospital and walked through the front entrance, dragging his oxygen tank behind him. At the information desk, he asked to see Dr. David Miller. The receptionist typed the name and said, Dr. Miller is an emergency medicine physician. He's currently on a 24-hour shift in the ER. I'm afraid he's not available for personal visits. Frank explained that he was family. The receptionist said policy required the doctor to approve visitors, and he was with patients. She suggested leaving a message. Frank stared at the desk for a long moment. He did not have time for messages. He did not have time for policies. He had hours, not days. He thanked the woman and walked back outside into the rain. He stood on the sidewalk looking up at the building where his son saved lives every day. And he made a decision. If the only way to see his son was to become a patient, then that is what he would do. And given the fire spreading through his chest with every breath, it would not require much acting at all. What happens when a dying man walks into an emergency room and comes face to face with the son he abandoned 3 decades ago? Frank pushed through the emergency room doors at 12:15 in the afternoon. He did not need to fake the chest pain. It was real, and it was getting worse. The stress of the journey, the failing lungs, the cancerous heart, it was all catching up at once. He told the triage nurse his chest felt tight and his breathing was labored. They took his vitals, and his oxygen saturation was dangerously low. Within minutes, he was in a bed with monitors attached and an IV running. He gave his name as Frank Miller. He gave his date of birth and his emergency contact as none. And he waited. 20 minutes later, the curtain pulled back and a man in a white coat stepped in holding a tablet. He was in his early 30s with dark hair and intelligent eyes, and a jaw that looked exactly like Frank's had looked 50 years ago. The name embroidered on his coat read, Dr. David Miller. Frank's heart clenched in a way that had nothing to do with the cancer. His son was standing 3 feet away, taller than Frank expected, stronger, confident in the way he moved, the way he held the tablet, the way he pulled up a stool and sat at eye level with his patient. David, his David, the baby he had held in the delivery room and promised the world to, the boy he had failed. David glanced at the chart and then at his patient, and something flickered across his face. A slight pause. A narrowing of the eyes. Frank Miller, he said slowly. Date of birth, March 15th, 1953. He looked up from the tablet and stared at the old man in the bed. Frank could see the wheels turning. The name, the age, the face, weathered and worn and thin, but still carrying the bones of the man in the one photograph David's mother had kept. Are you? David stared. Frank could not wait any longer. He had waited 30 years. He would not wait another second. David, he said, and his voice cracked like old wood. It's me, son. I'm your father. The tablet slipped from David's hands. It clattered against the metal bed rail and fell to the floor. The monitors beeped. The noise of the emergency room continued all around them. But between the old man in the bed and the young doctor on the stool, time stopped completely. David stood up slowly. His face was white. His hands were shaking, and in his eyes Frank could see 30 years of questions, 30 years of anger, 30 years of a boy, wondering why his father did not love him enough to stay. How do you explain 30 years of absence to the son you left behind when you were supposed to protect him? David did not speak for a long time. He stood beside the bed and stared at the man who had given him life, and then vanished from it like smoke. When he finally spoke, his voice was controlled and professional, but underneath it, Frank could hear the trembling of a boy who had waited his whole life for this moment. Do you have any idea what you did to us? David said. Do you have any idea what it was like growing up without a father? Do you know what Mom went through? She worked 2 jobs. She never dated again. She told me you were a good man who got lost, and I spent my entire childhood trying to believe her. Frank nodded slowly. He had imagined this conversation 10,000 times. He had rehearsed his explanations in shelters and park benches and VA hospital beds for 3 decades. But now that the moment was here, all his prepared words felt pathetically small. I know, Frank said. I know what I did, and I know that nothing I say can undo it. Then why are you here? David's voice broke on the last word. Frank looked at his son and told him the truth. All of it. He told him about Vietnam, about the 600 meters, about the 3 men he carried and the 2 bullets he took and the medal they pinned on his chest, while his mind was shattering into 1,000 pieces. He told him about the nightmares that came every night without fail, about waking up in combat mode, not knowing where he was, not recognizing his own house. He told him about the night in the nursery. You were 6 months old, Frank said, his voice barely a whisper. I woke up from a nightmare and I was standing over your crib with my fist raised. I was seeing the enemy. But it was you, David. It was my baby. And your mother was in the doorway, screaming, and you were crying, and I realized I was the most dangerous thing in that house. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I left because I was terrified I would hurt you, not because I didn't love you, because I loved you so much that I would rather you grew up without a father than with a father who might destroy you. The room was silent, except for the beeping monitors. David sank back onto the stool. His professional composure was gone. In its place was the face of a 12-year-old boy who had cried himself to sleep, wondering what he did wrong to make his daddy leave. Why didn't you get help? David whispered. Why didn't you come back after you got better? Because I was ashamed, Frank said simply. Every year that passed made it harder to come back. How do you show up after 5 years? After 10? After 20? What do you say? He paused. I'm saying it now. I'm sorry, David. I'm sorry for every birthday I missed. Every baseball game. Every moment your mother needed me and I wasn't there. I'm sorry for all of it. What does it mean to receive a hero's medal from the hands of the father who broke your heart? Frank reached for the wooden box on the table beside his bed. His movements were slow, every breath a labor, every motion costing him energy he did not have to spare. He placed the box on his lap and opened it with trembling fingers. Inside, resting on faded blue velvet, was the Medal of Honor. The ribbon was still brilliant. The star still caught the light. It was the highest military decoration the United States could bestow, and it had belonged to Frank Miller for over 50 years. I want you to have this, Frank said. He lifted the medal carefully and held it out toward his son. David stared at it without moving. I know it doesn't make up for anything, Frank continued. I know a piece of metal can't replace 30 years, but this is the only thing I have that's worth anything. And the story behind it, I need you to know that story, because it's part of why I am the way I am, and it's part of who you are too. David took the medal slowly. It was heavier than he expected. He turned it over in his hands, reading the inscription, feeling the weight of history in his palms. Frank told him the story. February 19th, 1969. Ambush in the Mekong Delta. His platoon pinned down by crossfire. 3 men hit, 2 of them his closest friends. Everyone else had pulled back, but those 3 were still out there in the open, bleeding. Frank did not make a decision. His body simply moved. He ran into the fire. He reached the first man and dragged him back. Then the second. Then the third. 2 bullets hit him, one in the shoulder and one in the thigh, and he did not stop. 600 meters under fire, with dying men on his shoulders. They gave me this medal, Frank said. They called me a hero. But David, I want you to understand something. What I did that day broke something inside me that never healed. Saving those men, the violence of it, the terror, the sound of bullets so close you feel them pass your face, it rewired my brain. I came home and I could not turn it off. The thing that made me a hero in Vietnam is the same thing that made me dangerous at home. David held the medal and looked at his father with new eyes. Not the eyes of an abandoned son, the eyes of a doctor who understood trauma. The eyes of a man who could finally see that his father's absence was not cruelty. It was a wounded man's desperate attempt to protect the people he loved from the monster the war had planted inside him. "You were a hero," David said quietly, "and being a hero cost you everything." Frank nodded. "It cost me you, and that was the highest price I ever paid." What happens when a son finally sees his father's wounds and realizes that absence was an act of love? David did not leave the hospital that night. He told the charge nurse he was staying with his patient. He did not say the patient was his father. He pulled a chair beside Frank's bed and settled in for the long watch. The monitors showed what David already knew from reading the charts. His father's body was shutting down. The cancer had spread to his liver, his bones, his brain. The oxygen was keeping him alive, but only barely. There was no treatment. There was only time, and very little of it. Around 2 in the morning, Frank began to move restlessly in his sleep. His hands twitched. His jaw clenched. His breathing became rapid and shallow. Then he started talking, not in English, in fragments of Vietnamese and broken commands and the names of men who had been dead for 50 years. David sat frozen in his chair, watching his father relive the war in real time. Frank's face contorted with terror. His arms reached out as if dragging invisible weight. He called out names David did not recognize, begging them to hold on, promising them they were going to make it. Tears streamed from his closed eyes. David had studied PTSD in medical school. He had treated veterans with it in the emergency room. He knew the clinical terminology and the diagnostic criteria and the pharmacological interventions. But watching it happen to his own father was something textbooks could never prepare you for. This was not a clinical case. This was the reason his father left. This was the nightmare that visited every single night for 50 years. This was what Frank had been trying to protect him from. David understood now, completely and finally. His father had not left because he was selfish. He had left because he was sick with a wound that nobody could see and nobody in 1973 knew how to treat. He left because love and terror got tangled together in his broken brain, and the only solution he could find was distance. The nightmare passed around 3:30. Frank opened his eyes and found David still there, still sitting, still watching. The old man's eyes filled with tears. "You stayed," he whispered. David took his father's hand and held it firmly. "I'm not going anywhere, Dad." It was the first time in 30 years that David had called him Dad. Frank closed his eyes, and the first real peace David had ever seen on his father's face settled over his features like morning light. "Forgive me," Frank said. David squeezed his hand. "I do. I forgive you. You loved us the only way you knew how, and it cost you everything. I see that now. Isaiah chapter 61 says God heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds." In that hospital room at 3:30 in the morning, 30 years of brokenness began to mend. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough to let a father die in peace and a son live without bitterness. What are the last words a father should say to the son he lost for 30 years? By morning, Frank's breathing had changed. David recognized the pattern. He had seen it many times in his career. The long pauses between breaths, the slight rattling sound, the way the body begins to let go of its hold on the world. Frank knew it too. He had watched men die in the jungle. He knew what the end felt like from the inside. But this time, he was not afraid. He was not in the mud. He was in a clean bed with his son beside him and sunlight coming through the window. And for the first time in decades, the weight on his chest was not just cancer. It was lighter. The guilt was gone. Frank opened his eyes and said, "David, I need to tell you something before I go." David leaned closer. His father's voice was barely a whisper now. "I've followed your career," Frank said. "Every step. I kept every article. Every mention. When you graduated medical school, I stood in the back row where you couldn't see me. When you got married, I watched from across the street. I know I had no right, but I needed to see you become who you became." David's eyes filled with tears. His father had been there, invisible but present, watching from the margins of a life he was too broken to enter. "You became a healer," Frank continued. "You took all the destruction I brought into this world and you turned it into healing. I am so proud of you, son. I am so proud." David pulled out his phone and showed Frank the photos. His wife, Sarah. His two boys, James and Michael, 7 and 4. Dark hair and bright eyes and the kind of smiles that belong to children who feel safe. Frank looked at those photos and a light came into his eyes that had not been there in 30 years. "Grandchildren," he whispered. "I have grandchildren. You do, Dad. And I'm going to tell them about you. I'm going to tell them their grandfather was a hero who saved 3 men's lives in a war and then spent the rest of his life paying for it. I'm going to tell them that he loved us so much it broke him." Frank smiled. It was the most peaceful expression David had ever seen on another human being. The old soldier reached out and placed his hand on David's cheek, the way he had touched his face in the delivery room 30 years ago. "Tell them their grandfather found God at the end," Frank said. "Tell them he was waiting for me, and tell them I'll be watching." His hand slipped from David's face. His eyes closed. The monitor showed his heart slowing, beat by a gentle beat, until the line went flat, and the room was filled with a silence that felt less like death and more like departure. David sat beside his father and wept, not in grief alone, but in gratitude for 24 hours that redeemed 30 years. What if a man you thought abandoned everyone was actually saving people in the shadows for 30 years? The funeral was held on a Tuesday at the Veterans Cemetery outside Portland. David expected a quiet service. A chaplain, a flag, a few words over a casket. What he did not expect was the crowd. They began arriving an hour before the service. First came a group of older men in veterans' caps. Men from the VA hospital and the homeless shelter where Frank had volunteered for over 2 decades. Then came younger families, people David did not recognize, carrying flowers and wiping tears. A woman in her 50s approached David before the service and took his hand. "Your father saved my husband's life," she said. "Not in Vietnam. Here at home. My husband was going to end his life, and your father found him and sat with him all night and drove him to treatment the next morning. That was 15 years ago. My husband is inside playing with our grandchildren right now because of Frank." A man in a worn jacket stepped forward next. "Frank Miller found me under a bridge in 1998. I was a vet, 2 tours in Iraq, drinking myself to death. He showed up every single night for 3 months until I agreed to go to rehab. He paid for it out of his own pocket. I've been sober 26 years. Story after story, person after person. For 30 years, Frank had been unable to care for his own family, but he had never stopped caring for others. Every veteran in crisis, every homeless man on the edge, every broken person who crossed his path, Frank had been there, silent, sacrificial, asking nothing in return. The chapel was standing room only. The honor guard folded the flag with precision and placed it in David's hands. The bugler played taps, and the notes drifted over the green hills where rows of white headstones stood in perfect formation. David stepped to the podium and looked out at 100 faces, each one carrying a piece of his father's hidden legacy. "My father left my mother and me when I was an infant," David said. "For 30 years, I believed he abandoned us because he didn't care. I was wrong. He left because he was wounded in a way that no one could see, and no one knew how to heal. And when he couldn't be a father to me, he became a father to everyone else who was broken and lost and needed someone to show up." He held up the Medal of Honor. "This medal is for heroism in combat. But the real heroism of Frank Miller's life happened in shelters and hospital rooms and under bridges in the middle of the night. It happened in the phone calls he made to keep other veterans alive. It happened in the prayers he prayed on his knees every night for the family he loved too much to risk destroying. David looked at his two young sons sitting in the front row. Boys, your grandfather was a hero, and I want you to remember that being a hero is not about being perfect. It's about showing up anyway, even when you are broken. It's about loving people, even when it costs you everything. He placed the medal on the casket and stepped back. The sky above was clear and blue. A single hawk circled overhead in the stillness. Romans chapter 8, verse 28. All things work together for good for those who love God. Even 30 years of separation. Even a lifetime of hidden service. Even a 24-hour reunion that healed what decades of silence could not. Frank Miller's war was finally over, and his son carried the medal home to show his boys what it looks like when a broken man gives everything he has to love others in the only way he can.